why are there so many offerings? We think of this tabernacle being a pristine, white, clean place. Like, was it just soaked in blood?
Frankly, it would have been, and it would have smelled horrendously to us.
That was necessary to enter into the presence of God.
There's a whole system here that we are so far from.
How does that not connect to today? Because if the blood of goats and bulls are really cleansing people back then, what was missing? What are we doing now that doesn't apply?
The blood represents life. It cleanses it in a ritual sense. It purifies it.
What role does Jesus play? Because he paid the ultimate price. Hi, it's Cass. I wanted to first start off by saying thank you for listening. I created this because I could not find it anywhere else on the internet, and it takes a very small team and a large upfront investment to make it all possible. I really hope that you find it valuable. I would never expect anything from my listeners, and I'm always going to do my best to first outsource support from brands. However, if you do find value in this episode, I invite you to contribute an amount equal to the value that you have received, either through a one-time or a monthly donation linked in the show notes below. I understand that not everyone, though, can donate monetarily. So I ask that if you love Biblically Speaking and you cannot donate, please show your support by subscribing to this channel wherever you're listening so that it tells the hosting platform to show Biblically Speaking to more curious and confused Christians. In exchange for this support, I personally promise to you to always create the highest quality production possible. Thank you so much for listening. Now let's get to the show. Hello. Welcome to Biblically Speaking. I am your host, Cassie Bellino. Today we're talking about something bloody, and it's blood in the Old Testament. Because when I read the Old Testament, why are there so many offerings? It seems like a bloodbath. Seems quite gruesome. I want to know why. And why don't we do that today? So if you're asking questions in church like, why can't they touch dead bodies? Or why couldn't they drink blood? I've asked that many times on the show. Why were animals being killed for sins? And how does that relate to Jesus? How does that not connect to today? Because if the blood of goats and bulls are really cleansing people back then, what was missing? What are we doing now that doesn't apply? And what role does Jesus play? Because he paid the ultimate price. And how does that change the way that we view Jesus? And what are we struggling to understand here? We're going to be talking about blood today. Very misunderstood. I have many questions, and it's essentially the Old Testament sacrificial system. Animal sacrifices. And from a 2025 perspective, we don't do those anymore. Why not? If it was sufficient back then, shouldn't it be sufficient now? Why was an animal equivalent to my little white lie? I don't understand it, but today we will, because today my guest is Dr. Robert Holmstedt. You are highly qualified to talk about this. You're a professor of Hebrew, Bible, and Semitic languages at the University of Toronto. You hold a PhD in Hebrew and Semitic studies from University of Wisconsin-Madison. And before that, you earned your BA in biblical studies from Wheaton College. We love Wheaton College. That's where we were speaking with Dr. John Walton from. But you've taught everything. Right before we jumped on, you were saying, I'm a linguistics guy. I know language. I know Old Testament. And overall, your passion is theoretical and linguistic clarity on how we read the Hebrew Bible. So this is so clutch for today's discussion from a Hebrew perspective in the Old Testament, the Torah. What are these blood sacrifices in a 2025 English interpretation? Welcome to the show.
Well, thank you very much for having me on. It's a pleasure to talk with you today about this topic.
Yeah?
I think it's so misunderstood. And yet, as you've implied in the introduction, it's central to understanding the way that the New Testament describes Jesus and his work.
Central.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. All right.
Oh, I think I just ran across this last week. I was sitting with my family in Nebraska visiting, and we went to my sister's church with them. And the minister, the preacher, as he was giving his sermon, mentioned that as people read through the Bible, they often hit Leviticus and they stop. It wrecks them. It throws them off course for the entire year. Mm-hmm. And I've heard this over and over for decades. And I think it's tragic because it's in Leviticus that I think we really get a key to understanding what's going on with Jesus Christ. And we're missing something big.
To me, like, as a church-going Christian, Sunday school Christian, we don't talk about this. So it just kind of resonates in like, look at those kooky, archaic barbarians back then who were like this altar. We think of this tabernacle being a pristine, white, clean place. And when you read Leviticus, it's like, was this just like covered in blood? Like, was it just soaked in blood? And that's all we see is the carnality of it. And for you to say it's central, well, what an overlooked, underestimated element of the Old Testament that I've honestly never heard a sermon about.
Well, when you mention, the the blood, if everything's covered, frankly, it would have been, and it would have smelled horrendously to us. I mean,
Truly,
absolutely horrendously.
truly.
But I'm not comparing it to this, but there is an element that where this works. I mean, who among the audience likes gefilte fish? I mean, there are things that other cultures liked and dealt with the smells of that would make most of us sick, and I think that's the issue is it's just different. It's what they were used to. And there's a whole system here that we are so far from.
Hmm.
But I think we have to do some heavy lifting to actually make some bridges and understand, because frankly, it is the culture that the Messiah came out of. End
Yes.
stop.
And that's why you're here, is because what are we missing today when we need to put ourselves in the shoes of those people that normalize that we're okay with those smells? I mean, all we see today is like, that probably smelled like a battlefield. Like, that probably was guts and goo and blood. Like, that probably was disgusting. But to them, that was what was needed, that was necessary to enter into the presence of God. And just like from my studies, like, I have had some awe-stricken moments of like, imagine if we still had to like murder, I want to say murder, sacrifice a goat every time we told a white lie or felt guilty or did anything. I It would just be such a mess. So thank God for Jesus, just from like a hygienic perspective, but like obviously for the greater salvation.
And I think the other part is from a financial perspective, because this was a serious, I wouldn't say burden, although we could consider it a financial burden. If you had to bring a sacrifice in that was an animal like that, you were taking in a significant part of your wealth. So it's, all sorts of things he kind of removed from the picture when he fulfilled the system, and that's the way I see it.
So it's like, honey, no more lying about my weight. We can't, it's not in the budget this year for you to.
Yeah, exactly. You got to give a car away each time, right? Or
Oh my gosh. Just again, like that,
depends on your wealth.
really?
For some people, it'd be a bicycle. Other people, it's a car.
Because you read the Old Testament, it's like, oh yeah, they plundered the city. They walked away with thousands of camels and goats and oxen, and it's like, okay, so they were like a dime a dozen. But no,
No, no, and that's why
okay,
there are differences in the types of sacrifices they can bring in. There's a recognition of the different wealth in society, but still, except for the elite of the elite, like, the monarchs or some of the high nobles, any one of these major animals would have been a serious blow to their portfolio.
so it's almost like perfection had to be upheld because you couldn't really afford it, both salvitically but also financially, to sin.
Well, I think there's an element that if you transgress and you cause a problem for the sanctuary, and as we'll talk about, that's what this is really about. It's about the sanctuary because it's God's house. If you cause a problem, it's going to hurt. And so you need to think twice, and you need to think about the way you live your life to try to avoid those things that are going to be problematic.
It's going to hurt the church or it's going to hurt you.
It's going to hurt you. It's going to hurt financially. It's going to, there's a different kind of hurt, because there are some transgressions, as we can get into later, some transgressions that there was not a sacrifice you could bring for, because you were now at God's mercy, and his anger, is deadly. And so it could hurt your life. And in a sense, the most serious infractions are the forfeiture of your life.
Okay.
Um,
Just like for
but
context, is everything that we're about to speak on, this pertains to everything up until Jesus?
yes, in a sense, because what we're talking about is the entire ritual system that defined Israel's life on a daily basis from Sinai forward. It's it's what allowed them to be the nation of priests, the priestly people.
From Sinai forward. So
Oh
before
yeah,
that, didn't really apply.
it was ad hoc. I mean, you do have offerings. Noah makes an offering. Cain and Abel, of course, bring their offerings. Um, Jacob actually sacrifices. but it's it's outside this ritual system that centers around the sanctuary that God provides in the tabernacle and in the temple. It's all about that. All of these things relate to what happens to God's house when the priestly people, because they're all priests, so it's a big part of this. In Exodus 19, they're actually given their identity. They're going to be a priestly people, a holy nation. And all of this then centers around that temple that
Mm.
is what allows them to be priests. Because to set this up, you have after Genesis 3 this fracture of the relationship between God and humanity, and there's no direct access to God. The garden is blocked. And even if you, whether or not you take John Walton's views, I'm actually quite partial to his views on Adam and Eve as a priest and priestess in a garden sanctuary. It doesn't really matter. What comes out of Genesis 3 is a fracture. And God's interaction with humanity is ad hoc. It's, it seems like here, a little bit here, a little bit there. He sends an angel, he walks with them. It's the angel of the Lord, whatever it is, until you actually get to not only Abraham and picking a descendant of Adam and Eve to resume this priestly relationship, but then finally telling Abraham's people at Sinai, this is why I chose you to be a priestly people, to mediate. Here's the deal. You have to mediate between me, and I'm going to actually put myself in your midst, and the rest of humanity.
Mm.
It's trying to return to the situation that was set up in creation. In order to be that priestly people, they have to represent God, and they have to actually behave in certain ways, and that includes purity and
Mm.
holiness. And those are the concepts I think that really start confusing us. And then why the blood is involved in all of that.
Okay, so just to summarize that, it would be because I guess my prior interpretation would have been like God, creates everybody and then he pulls everybody out with Abraham and creates this separation and sets out these new rules. And it's almost like the rules and the separation is God reconnecting with his people. But to say God saying, I want you to be a priestly people, and in order for us to accomplish that, it can't be an ad hoc type of sacrificial offering system. It needs to be central to who you are in paying the price in becoming priestly.
Yes, I think there's much there that you're on the right track.
Okay.
Absolutely. You have to see it in terms of nested priesthoods, because Israel has its own priesthood who mediates for Israel. Israel is a priesthood to the rest of humanity. So it's this nesting, and each layer is a little bit further from God, who's at the center of it. But if it in the right working of it, it's smooth, and the communication lines are open between everyone and God at the center. I mean, in a sense, you got to see the priesthood, and what they're doing is mediating, is removing obstacles,
By
because
sacrificing? What do you
humans
mean removing?
removing obstacles in their mediation, because humans in our behavior, we're always throwing up obstacles between us and God. It seems to be our nature, whether you attribute that to Genesis 3 and following, or you think that's how God created us, a little more of a Jewish theology.
What would be like an
And
example of an obstacle that this removed?
well, so some of the sacrifices, at least outside of the Leviticus system, are to appease God's anger, right? So you do something like you disobey, and then once you recognize it, and if you did it intentionally, you're going to know you're doing it. You have to make amends, and those are the propitiatory. That's what that sacrifice is. Some sacrifices are devotional, and it's basically reminding God you're there, and reminding him that he's there, and that you acknowledge him as creator and the giver of all the produce of the land. Um, it's the others, the what's called the expiatory or cleansing or de-sin or purifying. I purifying sacrifices or purging sacrifices. Those are the ones at the center of much of Leviticus system. But we as humans, we because God is holy. And in fact, that's a bit of a difficult issue to get our heads around because frankly, there's no definition of holy apart from God. It's God's character. We're missing that quite often in our behavior. So it could be as something as simple as being unkind. It could be as egregious as, physically harming someone or worse. And all of those things, they put up obstacles between us and the creator who has created us to image him in creation. So
I see.
we have to fix it. We've got to do things to, address it, to remove those
Absolutely.
obstacles. Priests are supposed to help in that. They're supposed to facilitate that removal of
Yeah.
obstacle.
It's so interesting the way you're framing this because I think first read of Leviticus, it's like all of these new rules, all of this new obedience rather than the removal of obstacles. It's a very different headspace to approach it. Um, but okay, since we're focusing on offerings, removing the obstacles that separate us from God for a chosen priestly people, why was purity so serious in the ancient world versus like obedience?
Versus obedience.
Yeah, like
Oh,
why was purity? I'm just saying, like above all other things, why was purity the most important?
well, I'm not sure I'd set purity over against obedience. I'm not. I think they're operating on kind of different levels, and they're both important. Obedience is part of your action. Impurity is about, or purity and impurity is about a state. So, obedience is something you must do. And of course, Adam and Eve were disobedient in the garden, and that's very clear in their behavior. And it doesn't really talk about their purity or impurity. So, I'm not sure if I were forced to rank those, I would say that obedience is actually more important.
Okay, maybe
Yeah.
importance was the wrong
So,
term,
no,
but
it's
just like
okay.
how serious it was. It was clearly a
Yeah.
very serious topic.
And they're both super serious. So there's operating on slightly, they're different ways of viewing how we relate to God. Um, Purity is it, it's about our state of being in such a way that allows us to come near to God. To be in a state of purity is a requirement for us to approach. So you have, there's pure and impure. There's holy and there's profane, and they're all things that operate together. Holiness is defined as a kind of characteristic of God, so being kind of godlike, not in the having superpowers, but in terms of His priorities. And profane is kind of you know being not godlike. So, humans are in a regular state of profanity.
Oh,
No, I mean, I'm kind of making a stupid scholarly joke, but anyway, maybe it's not even scholarly. It's just being punny. So the humans, when we eat and we do things like this, we're kind of regularly getting ourselves, more human. We're doing things on a regular basis that are not godlike, and so if we um, uh, if we want to both approach God and be more like God, you have to both purify yourself and also holify or consecrate yourself. So their terms, the purity terms work in terms of especially the ritual system. Holiness is related to it, but it's just a slightly different thing. But I think part of these are to remind us always that, there are requirements, not just for state of being, pure, impure, but also character, holy, non holy. And you can't just be pure and unholy to approach God. You have to be pure and sanctified or holy or made holy,
I guess I have a
considered
question.
separate, considered special.
Okay, is the separation, the set apartness? I guess like I'm coming from a place of like, if he's God, I'm sure he can handle a few germs after I touched a dead body. And is it more so you need to be set apart and made pure and holy for yourself to be personally able to approach God? It's not a matter of like for God's sake, it's for your sake.
Well, I think those things are hard to separate, but I think that
Okay.
again, I would agree with you that it's really more for our sake, but it's because of who he is. It's, I mean, so there's two things I want to address there. One is what kind of you mentioned this last part of it, that uh, we have to be, we have to be in it's like what the prophets say. You've got to be in a right state or God's not going to accept your sacrifices. You have to be in a right state and with right intention if you're going to communicate with the creator because of who he is. And so there should be this kind of fire, underneath us all the time, not in terms of kind of an obsessiveness, but a reminder. And I think that's part of what the system is. It's a reminder in their daily lives that they have to, and all humans should, behave in ways that they know reflect the creator and their task to be as representatives. You mentioned germs with the dead body, and that's a great one because I think people are wondering, well, why is a dead body? It's the holiness of life. It has nothing to do with germs, or anything else. It's the fact that I used to tell my students that life, the sacredness of life, the sanctity of life, is the greatest principle running through the Bible, except for God's reputation or God's holiness. So he can take life because he created it and he's God. But no one else can take life without recognizing God as the creator. And that includes animal life. And that's why they have to drain the blood. The blood represents a life. He's like, yeah, I'm going to give you animals to eat. I'm going to give you the same kind of animals to sacrifice, but you got to drain the blood because the blood represents the life. Life is holy. You have to recognize me in this process. You can't do it without recognizing God.
So how
It's
does that relate
unallowable.
to an already dead body or an already dead?
An already
Hmm.
dead body was a living body, and it's now holy.
Oh, okay. So that's more of like we can't cross over into that realm that is now passed on. It
Well,
wasn't like hygienic. Like that wasn't the
it
cause for the
had
separation.
nothing to do with hygiene,
Oh,
and
okay.
they had to bury bodies. People died, animals died, they'd bury them, but then they had to go through a ritual cleansing or ritual purification. I really prefer the word purification because water cleansing the way we view the word cleansing is not always involved. It's purification. You have to go through a ritual purification, and then you're okay.
Okay. I want to take a minute and say thank you to the recording service that has made this podcast possible, Riverside. When I started my podcast, I had literally no idea what I was doing, and I just wanted a single way to record, edit, and share content without wasting time on different platforms. Then, a friend suggested Riverside to me, and I'll tell you what, it was literally an answer to prayer. With just one login, I can record my interviews with scholars, clip interview moments into Reels for Instagram and TikTok, and post directly onto my RSS feed and Spotify, all without the extra downloads, platforms, all of it. So for the curious and confused people like me, the best part is that the crew at Riverside actually listens to their users when they need help. I wanted an editing preset to save time on creating real templates, and they listened. They literally implemented a new feature. And since using Riverside, my social clips have reached over 1 million people each month. And I haven't even unlocked all the features yet. Live streaming is going to be next. So if you're considering starting a podcast or you just need to edit at a pro level for content or interviews, I cannot recommend Riverside enough. If this is helpful for you, I ask that you click the affiliate link I provided in the show notes description. It costs nothing extra to you, and it gives a small kickback to me, which helps the channel stay alive. Thank you so much. Now back to the show. Okay, so in summary, it's more like it's not dangerous or unhygienic. Like these laws for don't drink blood or don't go near dead bodies, these things that it's not because it was unsafe or dangerous for humans to be in contact with these things. It was more so they could be compatible with a state that was required to enter God's presence.
Yes. I don't know if you've ever seen the videos. I'm fascinated by these things of the men who work on the high wires, the electrified wires, the massive wires, the transformers. They actually have to ground themselves to it first by putting a rod out. And then once they ground themselves to it, then they can actually touch it and work on them. They have to prepare themselves and get in sync with the electricity running through those wires before they can actually participate or work with those wires. It's the same thing. God set up the standard because he created the world, and he said, if you're going to approach me, if you're going to work with me, if you're going to do the task that I set for you, you actually have to be in harmony with me
Mm.
in a couple different ways, in
I'm
state
sure
of
we'll
being, in intention, etc.
I'm sure we'll get to this later, especially with Jesus, but like what is the danger or the detriment that someone faces if they're not of right mind? They've been wilding out, they've been touching all the unholy things, and then they try to enter into that presence with God because they're out of alignment. They haven't grounded themselves. Is it just God won't respond to them? Is that what's going to happen? Or is it like, what's the risk here that we're
Well,
avoiding?
I think the least, I mean, yes, God not responding to them is the least that can happen. The most that can happen is he takes their life. They
Just
forfeit their life. So there are these cases of God's holiness. When the fellows were when the ark was coming back and is being transported on a cart, which it shouldn't have been. It should have been carried by on poles the way it was made to be. But it was coming back, and this was in the early monarchy, coming back to Israel because the Philistines had taken it earlier.
in First
Um,
Samuel.
yeah, and one of the fellows, the ark starts tipping, and one of the fellows reaches out a hand and touches it, and God strikes him dead. His intentions were great, but ignorance is no excuse. He was not in the state of holiness to touch that holy object. Dead.
This is where that fear of God comes into play.
The fear of God. Whenever we get to that word in Hebrew class, the students say, well, is it fear or is it reverence? And I say it's both. Sometimes it's reverence as if we're in awe of him, and sometimes you're quaking in your boots. Both.
Okay. Okay. So I think we're understanding what is the purpose for like like what was required within the sacrificial system, and it's to be in alignment, to be on brand, to be grounding yourself in the Lord before you approach him, just out of reverence for him and compatibility with his presence rather than the safety of our hygiene. So the sacrificial system,
Mhm.
what is that used for? The blood itself being spilled.
Yes, that's the great next point, because I think we've established the principles. And now you have this system set up, starting in Exodus, especially Exodus 19, where they're then said, you're going to be a priestly people. And they all agree, okay. And the they're given then the tabernacle to be in their midst. And, they're organized in numbers as a holy people, as a holy army, etc. And then we get to Leviticus, and you have all of these sacrifices and this discussion of how they're going to have to orient themselves on a regular basis. And I think the fundamental principle is now is the priesthood to the rest of humans, and they're going to have God in their midst. So on a regular basis, they have a higher bar of purity and holiness to attain. Therefore, they have greater expectations. And they they're faced with this. It's almost an impossible situation, because God warns them, if my house becomes too defiled, I'll leave. Well, if their identity is being a priestly people, God leaving is the same result as him closing off the Garden of Eden in Genesis 3. It removes God from speaking or being on a regular basis with humanity and creation. It is a huge, huge responsibility. And in fact, this is exactly what's depicted in Ezekiel 8 through 11. Ezekiel's vision of the temple is that the divine presence gets up on his chariot and leaves the temple because of the defilement. It's huge. It's one of those things, every time I read through it or I teach through it, I have to pause and reflect on the magnitude that what he warned is actually what happened. And it's because they allowed for his house to become too defiled. Well, he provides a mechanism, right? He provides a mechanism to actually address that defilement on a regular basis. And the things that require ritual addressing fall into a number of categories, and they're very hard to understand how they all relate. Because
Okay.
some things like touching a dead body, it's like, well, that's not a sin. No, it's not a sin. It just causes an impurity. Some other things are greater, and they're what we call sins. So there's two categories of kind of ritual, people often call ritual impurities, and then moral impurities, or however the language they use, they end up with these two categories. Some are moral and some are not moral. They're amoral. So the way to tie those together is it doesn't matter what they are to begin with. We have to come from the other end. We have to start from the sanctuary. All of them defile the sanctuary. That's what ties them all together. That's why they're all listed in there. Whatever defiles the sanctuary has to be addressed. And most things can be addressed by a ritual or a sacrifice.
Okay.
And the greater the thing, the sacrifice is required. And the blood in the sacrifice becomes that special cleansing element. Because as we mentioned before, whether you go to Noah, Genesis 9, where God talks about the blood is holy, the life is in the blood, or you look at passages in Leviticus where the same principle is said, like Leviticus 17:11.
Running my own podcast, I'm always moving too fast. I'm finding guests, I'm editing episodes, I'm creating reels, or guesting on other shows. Not to mention, I just live in a world that moves fast. Notifications, trends, endless to-do lists. You know what feels like a blessing in all that? Slowing down. I'd love nothing more than a moment to pause, be present, and choose something timeless. That's exactly what Dwell Label is all about. When I first discovered Dwell Label, it wasn't just about the clothes, it was about a mindset. Thoughtful, intentional fashion that doesn't scream for attention, but instead invites you to slow down. Their pieces are modern takes on classic styles, made to last, not just for the season, but for years. I love that I can throw on a Dwell Label outfit for editing in a coffee shop, Bible studies, or looking professional in an interview. It always feels right, comfortable, effortless, elevated. And here's the best part. Dwell Label does not just talk about rest. They live it. Their website literally doesn't work on Sundays because they believe in pausing and dwelling on what matters most. So if you're looking for high quality, timeless fashion that aligns with a lifestyle of intention and presence, I can't recommend Dwell Label enough. Shop Dwell Label with the link in the show notes and use my code BIBSPEAK15, BIBSPEAK15 for an exclusive discount at checkout. Take a breath, slow down, and dwell in the good things. Now, back to the show.
The blood represents life. Impurity is associated with the opposite of life, death. So it's like this positive negative thing where the blood counteracts what the impurity actually does on the altar and the temple or the tabernacle earlier itself. Those are associated with God. Those are the sanctuary, the holy place that he spends his time. The altar represents him receiving the sacrifices. That's why the blood is put on the horns of the altar. It cleanses it in a ritual sense. It purifies it. And that allows him to stay in their midst. The most egregious transgressions, of course, have not only can the person who murders, intentional sin, murders, the person cannot bring a sacrifice to purify the sanctuary. That person has also forfeit their life completely. And even if it was, even in the case of unintentional homicide, they have to flee to a Levitical city, have to stay there until the high priest dies, because that death represents a life for life. And then they're
Oh,
free. So it's very strict. And the impurities accumulated on the sanctuary by all of those sins are wiped away once a year in the Yom Kippur ceremony, the Day of Atonement, Leviticus 16. Then you have that one, which is kind of a wiping everything clean for maybe all those things that we didn't recognize we did, because unintentional sins sometimes, if they're unintentional, sometimes they're unrecognized, right? But also the intentional sins that no sacrifice can actually address on a regular daily and weekly basis, once a year. So you have these types of cleansing mechanisms that God provides to keep his sanctuary pure. None of them actually purify the bringer. That's one of the major things that I find that
Whoa.
is fascinating. The blood never purifies the person bringing it.
I thought that was the whole point.
This, yeah, I know.
I
In
thought
fact, we
me, me,
have
me,
these,
me, 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 me.
yeah, we have these hymns that I continue to come across. Washed in the blood of Jesus, or washed in the blood of the Lamb, or washed in His blood, and it goes on and on and on. And it's absolutely not biblical.
Wait, so my sin tarnished the tabernacle, so I need
Mm-hmm.
to go cleanse it. But I
Cleanse
still
it.
sinned. So what do
Mm-hmm.
I do? I'm still that horrible person that told a white lie.
What do you do? You tell
What do I
me.
do?
What do you do?
Uh, I repent.
Absolutely.
I
And you ask God's
become,
forgiveness, right?
and then He sanctifies me.
And then yes, that's right. He forgives you.
I can't cleanse myself.
No, no, there's really no cleansing. He forgives you, right? But you have to understand these things are all the ritual system. But let me ask this: and you're an ancient Israelite and you've had some transgression, and you want to ask God's forgiveness, but you've allowed the temple to become so defiled he leaves. Can you ask his forgiveness? Is he
Mm-mm.
there? Do you know he's there? No. He doesn't promise in that context to actually hear people. He promises to be there permanently, as long as they don't defile the temple, for communication with humanity. But once he leaves, it's all up in the air. That's the devastating thing that's the parallel between Genesis 3 and Ezekiel's vision. God leaving the temple means that he may hear us, but he may choose not to.
I am still stuck on the fact that I sin. So it feels like, okay, I messed up. Now I need to give back. And now, once I give back to the altar in my offering, I have now redeemed the wrong that I have done. So now I'm good from a soul perspective on my way to heaven. And you're saying it's not. It's saying
No,
my actions have tarnished the tabernacle and now I have to cleanse it. But once the tabernacle is cleansed, um, I just personally have to repent and ask God for forgiveness as
mm-hmm.
long as He's there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you can make devotional offerings. I mean, that's what those were for, to make him happy,
What
to
do you
to
mean?
show devotional offerings. The first fruits, those kinds of things. You can take those offerings in, and it tells God and shows him that you acknowledge him, that you're worshiping him, perhaps even that you love him, right? That is apart from what the blood is doing on the sanctuary. That's why there are different kinds of offerings.
So, how does Jesus come into this?
Well, that's the beautiful thing. You know, it's I, there are so many models of what Jesus does, and I find so many of them inadequate, because I find that they depart from the biblical text. And in fact, even though they may feel like they're grounded in the Gospels or Paul or Peter or James or Hebrews, I think those guys actually understood the Jewish sacrificial system really well. But within a couple centuries, when Christianity moved west, I think we lost it. And I don't blame them, because they didn't do historical. It was a different culture in the West, and they didn't do the kind of historical research we do now. But now we have those tools, and now I think it's long been time to right some of these wrong interpretations. And it doesn't actually lower our Christology at all. In fact, I think it makes the whole system make beautiful sense and makes it extremely powerful. So if Jesus is actually, his blood is doing something sacrificial, which of course is extreme. It's a human sacrifice, which is not allowed in the Old Testament sacrificial system. He's a human sacrifice. But it is it seems to be what, however we want to read this. I mean, I'll just say that apparently this situation with humanity had reached a tipping point. God said something extreme has to be done. And so the concept of Messiah was something fairly old. It comes out of the Old Testament. And so he sends his Messiah, not so much different than prophets in the past, but in this case, instead of simply living an extreme life like Ezekiel or Hosea and the prophets of the Old Testament, he gives his life. And the acceptance of Jesus' blood within the ritual system cleanses the world, purifies the world as God's house permanently, which is why the curtain is ripped. God, with that blood, by accepting that holiness, that blood, God is saying, I'll be here. That system's done. It's completed. I'll be here. Not just in the temple. I'm here.
The
Because
system
of Jesus' blood.
the system is no longer here, the one that we have to appease God so he stays.
We don't have to ritually attend to the sanctuary so that he stays. He's here. We have to please him. That's different. We still have to worship. We have to recognize. So, in pure ritual terms, the temple's done with Christ's work. Of course, you do have that extension of the temple as a metaphor to our bodies, which is extremely powerful. Because what Paul does then is he makes, especially those in among his audience who were Jews would have understood this and hopefully communicated to the Gentiles. He's making them think you have to now keep yourselves pure if you want God and the Holy Spirit to dwell in you. And that personalizes the whole system, democratizes it in a way that becomes mind-blowing.
Yeah.
And it's like magnitude. Oh my word! Now I've got to do this. I'm responsible for this, and it is. It's. Once you think through these things, you realize, man, that's a heavy burden. That's really awesome, but that's really a heavy burden. But there's no way around it. This is what we're told. It's not a choice.
Just the translation of all of that from his death to the followers must have been a task. But I guess my remaining question after that is like, okay, I understand it. Like, he is present, he is here. It's translated to our bodies that God now dwells within, that we need to maintain purity. So where do offerings and sacrifices fall then at that place?
Well, the de-sin offerings, the ones that you bring to cleanse or to purify the sanctuary, they no longer exist. Again, his was the last one. Hebrews makes that very clear. His was the permanent one. His was the one that could even purify the heavenly sanctuary that apparently had become, in Hebrews term, the letter to the Hebrews, become human defilement had reached the heavens. And so it required something extraordinary. And so Jesus' blood was effective for that. But the devotional offerings, the first fruits of our labors, all those things that recognize he is the Lord of creation, the Lord of our lives, we are his imagers. All those are still, we just translate them in different ways.
Oh, okay.
You take tithes to church, that's a form of first fruits.
Got it. And being clean and unclean, that still mattered as well?
So the ritual, the purity and impurity, I think that so that I'll be honest, I'm still working that one through in terms of
Okay.
if it's the gospel effects on that. On the one hand, God is holy, and that doesn't change, and God is pure, and that doesn't change. And humans are often not holy and impure. That doesn't change either. So what I'm working through is that how do you work? How is that whole idea in kind of a very synthetic and whole New Testament way worked through? Of course, you've got in Acts Peter's vision, which seems to set aside all of the dietary laws and clean and unclean or pure and impure distinctions. Does that mean that everything was allowable or everything was considered, pure for Christians? I don't know. I really don't know about that. I think there are probably still things that make us impure, defile us. It's just that we don't have to take those sacrifices. And I think what it's done is simply taken out one level to the system, Christ's work, and allowed us to ask forgiveness. And I tend to think he still wants us to reflect on whether we're behaving in ways that are pure and pure. Now, we don't have to worry about certain animals in our diet or anything else. That's something that seems to be set aside, and that was something that seemed to be specific to the priestly people in that system. I mean, and I say in that system because Peter makes it very clear that he sees Christians, Jews and Gentile Christians, as that priestly people taking on that priesthood role in First Peter. So that mediating role hasn't been done. It just now is carried out by those who followed Jesus as the Messiah, but serve the same God. So I would say then purity is still an issue. I haven't figured out exactly how that falls out. And I want to see it as a principled thing, but I don't want to get into the kind of system where we're, checking up boxes and things, because I think Christ and Paul and Peter and the rest of the writers in the New Testament are pretty clear that's not Christianity.
So it's almost like what we had before and then Jesus, and so what happens to it. And we talked about unclean and clean and purity and the offerings and sins, but what about the need for a temple or a sanctuary? Does that go away as well since Jesus paid the final price?
Yeah, I think the temple is done. I think the temple, with his death, the whole reason for the temple existing has been tied off.
Got
It
it.
was a beautiful thing where God promised to be, as long as it wasn't too defiled. And with Christ's work, he simply promises to be in the world and listen and be there for humans who approach him. Um, I think the priesthood is a similar thing. On the one hand, a ritual priesthood, I don't think there's any need for it. On the other hand, because it's extended to all of us, we're all priests.
Mm.
We're priests to anyone, to each other, but anyone who has not recognized their true identity as a creation of this God.
So at the beginning, when you were saying that blood is the central thing that connects us to Jesus, is this how you meant it? Is that he pays the final price?
Mm-hmm.
And how are we today supposed to look back and how are we, what are we supposed to say to ourselves when we look back on this other than thanks Jesus for clearing up my schedule and I don't need to own animals? What else should we be thanking Jesus for that we kind of miss?
Well, the fact that we can simply in our chair or on the floor if we kneel or prostrate ourselves or while we're lying down, pray to God and have assurance that he listens is entirely due to Christ's blood work. Entirely. Otherwise we wouldn't have any idea. We'd be like, I don't know if he's there or not. Right? He might have stepped out for a while. It's totally up to him. This is the promise. This was the extension of the promise in the temple that then becomes extended to the whole world. So uh, we we would, I think, find it the life of faith nearly impossible if part of our theology was not that God hears us.
Well, when you put it that way, oh my gosh. Okay. There's that moment we talked about. It's happening.
Yeah.
Um, what else do we miss in Leviticus? Like, what's happening at Leviticus that is redeemed at the cross that we just completely miss that connection with?
Well, I simply think that we so misunderstand that whole system that we talked about that we forget that because those sacrifices, those rituals get in our way, and we're not really understanding their function. We assume it's a, to use kind of the theological words, it's a covenant of works or a system of rituals instead of grace and mercy. It's absolutely not. God was interacting with the Jewish people in a way that's very similar to the way he wants to interact with Christian people. He wants us to approach him, he wants us to repent, he wants us to experience his forgiveness, and he wants us to go out and do it differently. And that is there behind it, everything Leviticus. And in fact, the second half of Leviticus, the holiness code, is very much about personal holiness. And one of the things that comes through that book is something that does not go away. God says, be holy because I am holy. And Christ doesn't remove that. In fact, Christ reinforces that.
Would you say that Christ was also cleansing us, fulfilling a covenant, and then substituting a process that we currently had? He does all three of those.
As I mentioned, I'm not fond of cleansing. I'm not sure Christ purifies us. Again, the way I see his sacrifice and his work is a bit different. He is our high priest, mediating for us all the time, according to Hebrews. But the purification comes from the Father, and so I think that and the forgiveness comes from the Father. That's just the way that the language directs us to think about it. I think what he's done is we go back here. If you want to simplify Christ's work, we go back to that language of what priests do. Priests are supposed to remove obstacles.
Mm-hmm.
Christ has permanently removed all obstacles between us and God so that we can communicate with him freely. It's not as if things that we do or don't do are all okay. They still upset God, but there are no longer any hoops to jump through to recognize, address, and fix the problems you've created. He's just removed levels. He's cleared it all away. It's like he came into a room that was full of staircases, tore them all down, and put an elevator in.
That's an interesting note because I feel like a lot of people interpret what Jesus did as the cross of it's okay if I sin today because Jesus already paid the price. Not as like a pass, but I sinned, Jesus already paid the price, so like it's going to, balance out at zero because of what Jesus did. And you're not saying that here. You're saying
No.
Jesus allowed us to access God, so when we sin, we have access to God to forgive us.
Mm-hmm. I do, and I read all of the ransom language. The ransom language in the New Testament, I think, is
Wow.
reflecting the ransom language in the Old Testament. And I think there's two ways that, and some of that's mistranslation. I really do think um, the ransom, the real word ransom, is where you are buying something that has been otherwise committed. That has an obligation that you're buying it out of. That's ransoming. That's one thing that comes through in the New Testament that Christ's work does. That he's kind of ransoming our obligation to God that weighs us down, because we do such things that are, again, our life is forfeit and there's no way around it, and that's what he's ransoming. But that's not the blood work. The other work, ransoming the atoning, I really don't like the word atone.
Oh,
It doesn't work, and I'm so tired of people trying to make a pun on it, like at one, all this stuff. It's purging. It's a purging and or a covering. Either one, you purge, you remove something, you're scraping it away. The other one is you're covering it over. Presumably, it's not just out of sight, out of mind. It's you're covering it in the way that something substantively covers another thing, like a coat of sealant, right? The same thing with the noun that's involved. That's supposed to. It's often sometimes referred to as the ransom and the Day of Atonement. It's the noun purging, not the activity, but the thing that purges or the thing that covers. And so even the Day of Atonement's the day of purging. And so what his sin did was his sin purged, but it didn't purge us. And I've gone through New Testament looking at all the sacrifice language, looking at all the language about what Christ's work did in terms of um, his blood, etc. All of it fits in this system I'm talking about. All of it fits in terms of there's no passage in Paul or Peter or Hebrews where being justified by his blood or being purified by his blood need to be taken any way other than them recognizing that his blood cleansed the or purified the temple, not us. The result of those passages, the net effect for us is access to God. The net effect is that we can we can be the recipients of his mercy if we approach him.
is that what they mean when Paul calls us living sacrifices?
So when living, I think when we're living sacrifices, it's not those blood sacrifices. I think it's the devotional ones. We offer ourselves as the first fruits, as the free will offerings, as the peace offerings. We offer ourselves out of love for God.
Got it.
And we're his then. That's the point. When you take things to the altar stands for God. That's his now, his property. You know, seeing ourselves as sacrifices is simply returning to maker, return to the, sender, as it were. It's it's kind of uh we're his anyway. He made us. While this is just us actually getting through our thick heads, yeah, that's right. We're his.
Well, on that note, that's loving. I mean, okay, we talked a lot. This was some deep theology today, so thank you. But again, like a lot of people who open the Bible, they go to Leviticus. It's just gross. That's just one of those things where that they cannot relate to it. It's a lot of blood. So, what would you say to someone that finds the system, foreign and disturbing and disgusting? Like, how would you recommend someone to even like get to where you're at? And we got pretty far in this conversation. So, aside from listening to this, any advice on just like even if you still feel disgusted, how to navigate that?
Yeah, well, I think it's recognizing that your culture probably looks disgusting to someone else. And I'm not a cultural relativist. I mean, in the sense of, I think there are some absolutes in culture that we're supposed to abide by. That's a delicate thing to sort through. I'm actually not convinced that this system in the Old Testament is some of it is not absolute. I actually suspect some of these things, these are absolute principles about God. It's just trying to sort through what is, what isn't, as we've been talking about. So, but what I would say is get over it. Just you have to get over your own, kind of visceral response to things like the gefilte fish. I remember when I first walked through the souk in the old city of Jerusalem, the smells overwhelm you, and some people really have a strong reaction to those kind of other market environments and the smells. And I just thought it was fabulous, right? It was so different. So different can have both an attraction and a revulsion response in humans. And if they find Leviticus revolting, it's like, well, it's if they're reading it because it's in the Bible, then they kind of got to get over that. And I would say don't lose the forest for the trees. You can get stuck on these words and this, that, and the other, and you can kind of get stuck on there's all these procedures. Back up. Just back away and say, what's generally going on? I'm going to take that away. And, and to that effect, I would say, God wants his people to be holy, and he wants them to approach him in the right state. And I think you can take that. That's actually a profitable start to reading Leviticus.
Mm. Oh, beautifully said. Thank you so much for coming on and explaining this at such depth. I'm sure everybody wants to know more about how to connect with you and your work. So if you have any seminars or readings or books, how can people connect with you, Dr. Homestead?
Well, I do get emails, kind of randomly, and I try to respond to them from regardless what they are, and I'm happy to engage in that. I I have a couple commentaries out there. The problem is that my commentaries are Hebrew grammatical commentaries. The way I've talked about them, they're either for advanced students or for their scholars who are actually writing the other commentaries, and I work through the grammar of what the Hebrew is actually saying in Esther or Ruth or Ecclesiastes or some of the others I'm working on. So my work is all fairly technical, except it's funny. I love teaching at the intro levels because this translating and making the Bible both foreign and exciting at the same time is something I love doing. So
Yeah.
maybe one of these days I'll follow in your footsteps and there'll be something more accessible out there. I'm not as cameragenic, so you know I've hesitated, but people could always just email me. But there are some great resources. You mentioned John Walton at the outset. John has, and I've known him for many years, and I love his work, and it's very accessible, and I think he has some great ideas. For Leviticus, I'm not sure if he's gotten to the sacrifices yet in his series, but that's one thing I'm willing to do. If people email me, I'm always willing to point them to other resources because there are a lot of good resources.
Okay. Do you mind
They
if I
just
add your Do you mind if I add your email to the show notes below?
No, that's fine. That's
Okay,
fine.
cool.
Yeah,
Okay, just making
I'm
sure.
happy.
Amazing. Well, I'm going to find a reason to bring you back because everything you just stated is like what I'm curious about. So, thank you for coming on. Thank you for coming back again on in the future. You're always welcome back, Dr. Homestead.
Thank you.
But
Thank you
thank
for
you.
the opportunity. It was fun.